studying in the book of Lamentations, we are looking at the big sovereign picture, the large, overarching sovereign picture concerning the Word of God. And we're doing that in the book of Lamentations. Last week, this is the third week that we've been into it. We've already looked at the outline of Lamentations. We know that chapter 3 is the center point of this 5-chapter book. Jeremiah penned this book as he had observed, and perhaps a year later was writing these things down. God was directing him as he was writing. And chapter 1, it talks about Jerusalem's desolation, and the focus is on the people. And then chapter 2, God's judgment, and the focus is on the Lord himself. And chapter 3 is the real pinnacle. It's Jeremiah's response to all the things that are happening around him. And then chapter 4, he goes back to focusing on the Lord and his anger. And then there is a remnant's response, and that's back to focus on the people. We asked the question last week, how sovereign is God? How sovereign is he? Is he competing with anyone else out there? Is he sovereign over everything? Or are there things outside of his control? Sovereignty means control. Now, control can mean I'm moving things directly, or by law, such as the law of gravity. I have orchestrated all things that they should happen in this way. If I pick up this mic and the laws of gravity say that if I drop it, it falls. So God is in control of all of that because he established that law. For me to let go of this and it float, that would be contrary to the laws that God has designed. We call that a miracle, if that were to happen. So how sovereign is God? Well, Lamentations chapter 3, verses 1 through 18, states what God had done to Jerusalem, and it is reflected in Jeremiah. Jeremiah is reflecting upon all of this. In verses 1, 2, and 3, Jeremiah reflects the darkness without direction and hope. That's him. He's focused on himself. He is perplexed by all the things that are taking place. Remember, God has made a promise to Israel, starting all the way back in the Abrahamic covenant in Genesis 12. He promised, and reflected in Deuteronomy as well, God says, of you, Israel, out of all the nations of the world, I have chosen you to be my people, to be my nation, to represent me on earth. And I've made promises to you. God made promises to them. So when he brings the Babylonians to devastate Jerusalem, tear down the temple, it is devastating to Jeremiah, who's reflecting on all of these promises and wondering, why is God doing this, and how can God do this, and will he fulfill his promises, having allowed all of this destruction to take place? So there is darkness reflected in his outlook. There he observes starvation that's going on in verse 4. Verses 5 and 6, there's an emotional toll that's taken upon him. He realized in verses 7 and 8 that there was nothing that he could do to obstruct God's will. This was God's determined purpose because of Jerusalem, because of Judah's sin. God determined the destruction of Jerusalem in chapter 3 and verses 10 through 13. Very clearly stated there. This is God's doing. You can't blame this on anyone else. You can't blame this on the Babylonians. Though they are guilty, they are the instrument, and God is going to hold them accountable for what they do. And the reason he holds them accountable, and the reason he is going to judge the Babylonians, is because the Babylonians themselves do not give God the glory. They are arrogant. They become arrogant because they think their own strength and the mightiness of their own army and the number of their own chariots and horses is what gained them victory over Jerusalem. They did not give God thanks, and so God is going to visit them with his own judgment because of their arrogance. So in verses 10 through 13, he talks about this judgment in Lamentations 3. And then Jeremiah reflects on the humiliation for himself in verses 14 through 15. He says, I have become a laughing stock to all my people, their mocking song all day long. He has filled me with bitterness. He has made me drunk with wormwood. There was no serenity. There was no cheerfulness. There was no strength at all left in Jeremiah. Verses 17 and 18. He says, my soul has been rejected from peace. I have forgotten happiness. So I say, my strength has perished, and also my hope from the Lord. He has lost everything. He feels like he is lost. So from that point, we investigated verses 37 through 39. And let's recall God's sovereignty. Jeremiah, is there a way out of this? And our theme there was God is accountable to no one. So as Jeremiah observes all of these things taking place, and as we also ask the questions, why are bad things happening to God's people? Why are people starving all over the world? Why does God allow governments to arise and to oppress people the way that they do? With all the child trafficking and everything else that takes place in this world and all the drugs, people taking advantage of others, why does God allow all of this to happen? And is he in control of all this? Well, verses 37 through 39 is an example or an illustration of God's sovereignty. So we're going to be reminded of God's sovereignty, and that's what we were reminded of last week. In verse 37, who is there who speaks and it comes to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? That speaks of God's supremacy. So Jeremiah inquires, he asks, and he asks this question, and the phraseology of the verse discusses God's sovereignty in creation. In Genesis 1:3, originally stated that God spoke and it came into being. God said something and the result was these things came into being. And the point is that the Lord rules creation and he rules history. But you can see that it's a question. Grammatically, this question asks if anyone can accomplish such a feat unless God commanded it. Is it possible for anything like this to happen unless the Lord commands it to happen or unless the Lord sovereignly allows it to happen? Who is there who speaks and it comes to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? Can anyone else match God's supremacy and power and control? The answer, quite obviously, is no. So the question points out the question points out that the only reason Jerusalem fell is because God was sovereign. This could not have happened unless God allowed it or determined that it would do so. Babylon could not speak, and it happens, unless the Lord who desires judgment did not ordain it. So overall, this verse shows God's matchless preeminence. And you can apply this truth to any circumstance you can think of in this world or that's ever happened, ever been a part of this world. Nothing takes place unless the Lord has commanded it. So the Nazism that came to be and sought power in World War II, the Lord allowed it, the Lord commanded it to happen. It was for his good purposes. Though we don't know all of those purposes, yes, the Lord was in control over all of these things. Verse 38 talks about the source. Verse 38, is it not from the mouth of the Most High that both good and ill go forth? This verse claims that God is not only supreme, but he also is the source of all things. His control is not only absolute, but it is comprehensive. What is the mouth of the Lord? It is the source of his authoritative word. When he speaks, it's with authority, and it's true. Because the people of Judah did not heed his word, then they're going into exile. Because they did not listen to his authoritative word, they're going into exile. In the next line, in verse 38, that both good and ill go forth, Jeremiah declares that the Most High decrees in history both good and evil, which is an amazing statement. A large theological question arises here regarding whether God perpetrates moral evil. God is not perpetrating moral evil. He was certainly in charge of this recent calamity that Jeremiah had watched. His sovereignty covers even these type of events. However, he ordains not only these events, but also the good ones. So God's comprehensive Sovereignty means that hope exists because he has power both to judge and to restore. Though he has the power to bring Babylon and do what they did, he also has the power to stop Babylon from doing what they did if he so desired to do. So how sovereign is God? You have in verse 37 his supremacy. You have verse 38, the source of all of this. And in verse 39, salvation. God's goodness, his justice, and his sovereignty preclude a person from complaining, even if he expresses his suffering to God himself. Why should any living mortal or any man offer complaint in view of his sins? How is it that we can have any kind of platform to go before God and complain when we're full of sin and he's not? Jeremiah has not questioned God's goodness or ability to provide in communicating through this thing that he's going through now, communicating his pain. He hasn't questioned God's goodness and ability. Jeremiah confesses his agony, and he also confesses God's loving kindness. More to the point, God's mercy makes it ridiculous for anyone to doubt him. The individual referred to here is a living person. Why has any living mortal or any man? Why should any living person or living mortal or living man? So this is a living person. It's a phrase that most likely emphasizes survival through this ordeal that Jeremiah has seen. So the fact of living through such horror stems from God's intervention and provides an avenue for hope. Those people who lived through and were not utterly slaughtered and wiped off the face of the earth, for Israel is proof that there is hope because God has preserved them. And Jeremiah's point is that one cannot complain against God when the situation is not God's fault. God's sovereignty over the circumstances for the living speaks of intervention. Can anyone find fault for him, or can anyone fault him for that? Can they lose hope if he has given evidence of his goodness and his deliverance? Certainly not. God is in charge of all of this. And he is in charge. He's the same God who operates today. So will God, doing all of this, bringing all of this about, will God respond to suffering and injustice? Will he ever do this? Jeremiah may be thinking, Lord, you're doing this. Are you ever going to respond to this? It seems like it's ongoing. It seems like it will never end. Well, for that, we go back to verses 34 through 36. So just move up the page just a little bit to verse 34. To crush under his feet all the prisoners of the land, to deprive a man of justice in the presence of the Most High, to defraud a man in his lawsuit. Of these things does not the Lord approve. Of these things the Lord does not approve. Will God respond to suffering and injustice? God is sovereign, and he is a God who gives hope because the Lord is a God who responds to suffering and injustice. Absolutely, he will. God will respond to this. Before we look at these three verses and try to answering this, there is a little bit of an interpretive issue that we need to talk about just a little bit. In verses 34 through 36, we need to understand the very last line. Verses 34 through 36 is looked at as a single unit. The very last line of verse 36 is the interpretive issue. So we're looking at these three verses. Does God care? Does he care? What verse 36 says, of these things does the Lord not see? And he certainly does not approve. So how did I get that? Let's look at that. Each of these verses, verse 34, 35, and 36, begins with a to. Do you see that in English? To crush, to deprive, to defraud. Now, if you are familiar with English, you know that in English, infinitives begin with to. Participles end with ing. Remember those little rules from third grade? Well, infinitives begin with to something. And that's what you have. Verse 34, 35, 36 begin with infinitives in Hebrew. So they're translated to crush, to deprive, to defraud. And they all depend on the very last line in verse 36. They depend on, of these things does the Lord not see? Or of these things the Lord does not approve. What does he not approve? To crush people that are crushed under his feet, people that are deprived of justice, people that are defrauded. Does the Lord not see these things? And the implication is, yes, he does see these things. Again, we're asking, does God care? Will he respond to suffering and injustice? Even today, and the things that are going on today, will he respond? So each verse begins with that to clause, that infinitive there. And what they do is they express result or intention or purpose. These three infinitives there depend on the main verb, and really they depend on the main word at the very end of verse 36, approve. The word approve there is literally the word see, to see in Hebrew. Literally, to see. So you can think God does not approve, or these things does not God see these things. The implication was, yes, he does see, and he doesn't approve of them. Which is why sometimes you have in your translations, it may be translated approved, or approve, or see. So there are a couple of different ways to translate this. One way to translate that verb approve is to translate it approve rather than see. Another option is to translate that word in verse 36 as literally see. And you understand this as a more cynical statement. God does not see all these actions against his people. Well, we know that God does see all these actions. A third option also translates the verb see, but it makes it a rhetorical question. God does not see all these things, doesn't he? Doesn't God see all these things? Implications are, yes, he does see all these things. That third option making it a rhetorical question. Does God not see the injustices done against Israel? And there's a positive answer that is implied. Yes, he does. That's, I think, the best option. And I think the King James, if you have a King James, I think it's translated to see. Isn't it, Fred? Into verse 36, or these things the Lord does not see? Approve. Not. Approve not. Yes. Okay, yeah. So it makes it into a rhetorical question, but it doesn't use the word see. Anybody else's translation have see? Okay. I think approve, as long as we understand the word approve is that God sees this, and the approve is a rhetorical question. Certainly, God does see these things against his people, and he does not approve. So I think the third option is best because the context here gives the impression of enjoyment or approval rather than the word itself. In other words, it's not necessary to translate see into the word approve to understand the context. And every time the word is used, the word to see is used in the book of Lamentations, it refers to sight, literally seeing. And there's no contextual reason here for a different translation in this verse. And if we talked about the second option there, where we translate it, see and understand it, God does not see these things against his people. Well, the truth is, God does see these things against his people. He is not blind to the injustices. He is confident of the opposite. So I think the best way to understand this is a rhetorical. Does God not see these things that are done? Yes, he does see them. God does see injustice, and he will act The Lord is aware of suffering and injustice, and nothing that takes place, good or evil, escapes God's notice. Several times in Scripture, we're in Lamentations, in Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 4. Jeremiah chapter 12 and verse 4, it is stated, "How long is the land to mourn and the vegetation of the countryside to wither? For the wickedness of those who dwell in it, animals and birds have been snatched away, because men have said, He, that is God, He will not see our latter ending." Men have convinced themselves that God does not notice or see the things that they are doing. In Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 9, going the other direction, Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 9, Ezekiel writes, "Then he said to me, the iniquity of the house of Israel and Judah is very, very great, and the land is filled with blood, and the city is full of perversion. For they say, the Lord has forsaken the land, and the Lord does not see." So God does see. Nothing takes place, good or evil, escapes the Lord's notice. He knows, He sees all of this stuff. So when you get back to Lamentations 3:36, does God not see all the things, all the injustices taking place? The answer is clearly yes, He does see all of these things taking place. So verse 34, to crush under His feet all the prisoners of the land. Remember, we're asking, does God care? Will He respond to injustice? Does He care? Verse 34. This verse uses unique wording to the book. This wording is not found in the book up to this point. And the Hebrew is only 6 words. Very short, verse 31 is it. The Hebrew is only 6 words. Those who are crushed, that is oppressed, underneath, those who are crushed underneath the feet refer to those in complete subjection to a conquering foe. And the question is who the pronoun his refers to. You see in verse 34, to crush under his feet. Who is his? Is it God? Is that his feet, or is it the Babylonians? Well, the subject of verses 31 through 33, the section before this, is clearly God. God is the nearest antecedent. You can look in verse 33. He does not afflict willingly or grieve the sons of men. That's clearly God. Babylon does not grieve the sons of men. So He there is clearly God. Verse 34, to crush under His feet would most naturally be God He's referring to. God is the nearest antecedent to that pronoun. So it's the most likely referent there. The Babylonians are certainly involved. God uses the Babylonians to afflict His people. But from the mind of Jeremiah, Jeremiah is realizing that it is God who is doing that. It is God behind the Babylonians acting the way that they're acting. So he's looking past the instrument to the source, which is what he just reminded us of in verses 37, 38, and 39. The supremacy, the source, and the salvation. So the question is will God act? Will He respond to suffering? He says here that God is the one who crushes, to crush under His feet all the prisoners of the land. Though the Babylonians are certainly involved and God uses them, it is God who has become the enemy of His people. Because why? Because He's a capricious God? No, because His people have sinned. And so chapter 2, verse 4, in Lamentations chapter 2 and verse 4, it says that He has bent His bow like an enemy, that is God. He has set His right hand like an adversary, and slain all that were pleasant to the eye. In the tent of the daughter of Zion, he has poured out his wrath like fire. So God has become Israel's enemy, not because he's a capricious God, but because they have disobeyed him, and he's reacting. If God did not care, he would not discipline. He would not do anything in reaction to their sin. So God has forced Israel to go through immense subjugation and humiliation because of their sin. And Jeremiah has advised the people to submit to what God is doing by giving their mouth to the dust. An odd phrase. Look at verse 29. Just go up the page. Let him put his mouth in the dust. Perhaps there is hope. This is what Jeremiah has advised his people to do. You cannot fight God. This is because of your own sin. This is God's sovereign will. He has determined this would happen. Put your mouth to the dust. It refers to a posture of subjection. It means embrace God's will regarding this and go through this rather than fight it. So Jeremiah's encouragement, his exhortation now reminds the people that God will see their misery and act for them. Is he not aware of his own actions to subject his people and to make them prisoners of war? Of course he is aware of all this. The extent of Israel's suffering will garner his attention, God's attention. To crush under his feet all the prisoners of the land. The extent of Israel's suffering will garner God's attention. So there you have in that passage right there, be aware of God's wrath, verse 34. Verse 35, be aware of God's unfairness or the unfairness of this thing. Look at verse 35, to deprive men of justice in the presence of the Most High. This next line gives us, or it poses a parallel question. What will grab God's attention is not merely suffering, but also the issue of injustice. If we were to do a study of phrases in the scriptures that talk about being just, acting justly, being fair with the scales. You don't adjust the scales so that you give less food for more money. That kind of thing. You mistreat the widow and the orphan. You jack the prices up when there's a famine. Things like that. God doesn't approve of that at all. So what will grab his attention is not merely the suffering, but also the injustice. And that's what he addresses here. The idea of the phrase is that the court rules in favor of an individual. Put differently, this refers to the violation of fundamental rights before the law. The law, the Mosaic law, is worded in such a way and is designed to protect the individual from being taken advantage of. Too often against the most vulnerable who could not defend themselves, people would do these things. And that seems to be indicated by the context here. Since Israel is weak and in exile, they have done these things. And we could look at Amos chapter 5, for example, and there would be statements. You're going into exile because of your behavior toward the orphan, because of your behavior toward the poor, toward these people, or those kind of people. So such perversion of fairness, such perversion of his law angers God. That's the character of God. It's right for people to be up in arms today when there is injustice that takes place, when people bribe one another so that they get off the hook, so to speak, or that people pay money to obtain positions when they're not really qualified, when they don't go through the whole process, or a judge hands out a very unfair and unreasonable verdict. Those kinds of things do not please God at all. In Exodus chapter 23, Exodus chapter 23. Again, all of these statements are based upon and built upon the Mosaic law that God has given them. Exodus 23 verses 6 and 7 states this: "You shall not pervert the justice due to your needy brother in his dispute. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent or the righteous, for I will not acquit the guilty. You shall not take a bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of the just." Wow. From being overseas a few times, I can tell you a good part of the world operates on bribes, especially in those former communist countries. You don't get anywhere without bribes. Almost. The government is corrupt. It operates on bribes, which is a reason, not the only reason, which is a reason why the wall came down in some of those communist countries and people had the opportunity to have their own business and to sell and market stuff. And it really didn't work that well. Why? Because you have to bribe the city officials to get something. Or the city officials are corrupt and they won't let things happen. And so people can't get off the ground. There's not a judicial system to assure the fairness of free market trade. It's just full of bribes. Who has the most people who can make sure the competition doesn't do well. That kind of thing. These kinds of things are detestable to God, as we just read in Exodus 23. Furthermore, this happens right in front of the Most High. El Yon is the translation of that. It's here in verse 35 and verse 38 is the only two times that this title, this name for God, occurs in this book. So verse 35, "To deprive a man of justice in the presence of the Most High," El Yon. The enemies of Israel have performed injustice in the presence of God without any regard for Him. Will God not see this and respond? Yes. Look at the end of verse 36. "Of these things, does the Lord not see? Or does the Lord approve of these things?" That's where all three of these statements, the two statements, summarized in verse 36. Of all these things, crushing under the feet, depriving a man of justice, defraud a man of his lawsuit, does not the Lord see all of these things? That's where we're going with this. Again, the question is, will God respond to suffering and injustice? Will God bring about justice? Yes, He will. To answer that question. Absolutely. So, aware of wrath, aware of unfairness, and verse 36, aware of injustice. This final verse, or the final line here, specifies a certain type of injustice that has been perpetrated. The defrauding of a legal complaint. That's what is in mind here. This shows a heightening of injustice from the general practice of society to the courts. This is not a special case, in other words, it's not a unique case in any way. This is just the common general practice of society, where justice is supposed to be upheld. You can't even get a fair shake, so to speak, at the market down or at the grocery store around town. That kind of thing. The word lawsuit that you see in verse 36, to defraud a man in his lawsuit. That word there refers to an appeal to the court to resolve an issue. A man goes to the elders of the town and he files a complaint. So-and-so business down the street, he sends men and he destroys my shelf and he scatters all of my fruit and I cannot sell anything. But the people he goes to, the elders he goes to, does not exact justice. They give him some words. They tell him to well, we'll try to keep an eye on it, something like that. Even on those common general practice of things, the man cannot find justice. That's what he's saying. Even on these common things, even these kinds of things on the level where not everybody is aware, does God not see these things? Yes. Last line in verse 36. Does God not see even these things? Yes, he does. That's where we're going. So this man has requested justice. The court has suppressed his plea for help. It is made crooked or falsified. They twist his words in some way, and therefore they reject his complaint. This kind of injustice, which refuses to listen but distorts the law to silence, a petition for action, is abhorrent to God. Another passage, Isaiah chapter 5. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 23 and 24. Isaiah 5, verse 23 and 24. Listen to what Isaiah writes. Verse 22, woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine. I've known some of those in my day. People, he's cool, man. He can hold his liquor. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the one who are in the right. Wow. Therefore, as a tongue of fire consumes stubble, as dry grass collapses into the flame, so their root will become like rot, and their blossom blow away as dust. For they have rejected the law of the Lord of hosts and despised the word of the Holy One of Israel. So there you have a statement from Isaiah, some of the things that are taking place. God is very patient. We know that. We know there's a lot of injustice that goes on in the world. God is not overlooking this, and God is not oblivious to all of these things. God will judge. All of the wrongs in the world will be made right someday. That there's a day coming when there will be no more injustice. There's one reason why we say, come Jesus, come Lord Jesus, come quickly. Because there's so much going on in the world that's wrong. Come and make all things right. Call people to account for what they're doing. This is the perversion. This is a perversion of the very institution designed to maintain rightness. The very institution God designed so that this would not happen, that institution has become corrupt. And the final line, which, as we've said, has governed the previous three statements, the two statements, this final line here asks, does God not see these atrocities? We believe that it's best understood as a rhetorical question, implied, yes, he does. God surely sees the immense humiliation of his people, verse 34, where he says to crush under his feet all the prisoners, the humiliation of his people, as well as the justices that are done, verses 35 and 36. So this last line in verse 36 here affirms that God's plan will go forward because he is not blind. We wish that he would do it sooner rather than later, probably. But God's timing is perfect. He knows more than we do. It seems to us judgment is delayed, but it really is not delayed. If it is delayed, if judgment is delayed, it's for the sake of people who have not come to the Lord in faith as of yet. Peter tells us that. So this last line here affirms that God will go forward. He is not blind. He responds to his people, and because he cannot tolerate the evils done, he will do what is right in fulfilling his promises and ending exile as he always had planned to do. These things will not go on. And as we noted before, the word approve, all of you have a word approve. That's what it's translated. That word approve literally is the Hebrew word ra'ah, which means to see. And it is significant. Previously, Jerusalem and Jeremiah have called upon God to see and to intervene. Just go back a page and look at chapter 1, verse 11. All her people, that is Jerusalem, all her people groan, seeking bread. They have given their precious things for food to restore their lives themselves. See, O Lord, and look, for I am despised. So Jeremiah has called on God to see these things, to see what is going on. Verse 12, is it nothing to all of you who pass this way? Look and see if there is any pain like my pain, which was severely dealt out to me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. And you can see the same word in verse 18, the same word in verse 20, as Jeremiah is called upon God to see what is going on. And he asked rhetorically, does God not see? And the positive answer shows that, unlike the enemies who suppress Israel's cry for help, God will not do the same. God will not suppress Israel's cry for help. Rather, he sees everything and he will respond. This is the catalyst or the stimulus for why he will not reject forever. That's verse 31. But will turn his chastisement into compassion. That's verse 32. Jeremiah assures the people that God responds to their requests and their repentance. That's part of his character and his plan to end their exile. Therefore, they should look to him in hope. Be patient. Do not lose hope. God has not forgotten you. Yes, he does see these things. This is his character. God's character does not change. He changes sometimes what is the expression of obedience. The expression of obedience in the Old Testament was to sacrifice animals according to certain rules. Here's how you do this. The expression of obedience for the church, for us today, looks like being kind to one another, sharing the gospel with people, not forsaking the assembling of yourselves. That's what obedience looks like in the church age in which we live. But his character does not change. He never looks favorably upon bribes, upon oppression of the poor, unfairness, injustice. That is not God. And since this is all of these things that we've studied are the stimulus for why he will not reject forever, but will turn his chastisement into compassion, we can see that in verse 31, 32, and 33. We're kind of working our way backwards here. Look what he says. For the Lord will not reject forever. For if he causes grief, then he will have compassion according to his abundant loving kindness. For he does not afflict willingly or grieve the sons of men. He sees this, the humiliation of his own people, verse 34. Verse 35 and 36, the injustice. Does not God see all of these things? Yes. Well, who is there who speaks and it comes to pass unless the Lord has commanded it? God's supremacy. Is not from the mouth of the Most High both good and evil that go forth? Yes, God is the source of all of this. Why should any living mortal or any man offer a complaint in view of his sin? How can you do this? His salvation. You see Jeremiah's argument. We've just looked at it. We've made the establishment that his sovereignty rules, and then we go back one step and look at, does God see all of these things? And yes, he does. And so verses 31 through 33, what do they establish? God's character has not changed. The Lord will not reject forever. In verses 31 through 33, each of those verses begins with a for or a because. Take a look at your text. For the Lord, verse 32, for if he, verse 33, for he does not. It's a causal kind of thing. You can translate it before or you can translate it because. Because the Lord will not reject forever. Because if he causes grief, then he will have compassion. Because he does not afflict willingly or grieve the sons of men. So all three lines begin with that statement. And they're all examples of incomplete sentences. Now, they may not look like incomplete sentences in the English. For the Lord will not reject forever. And then he goes on. For if he causes grief, then he will have compassion. And then verse 33, all of those sentences, he breaks off. It's almost as if he doesn't complete his sentence. And this highlights, why does he do this? Why does he write this way? It highlights how Jeremiah is speaking with great emotion. Haven't you ever talked to somebody that's very excited about something and they stop mid-sentence and it occurs to you, wait, finish your sentence. You started one sentence and you stopped right in the middle of it and you went on to another sentence. Have you ever heard anybody do that? I hear people doing that all the time. I listen to talk radio and I hear Sean Hannity do that all the time. He'll start something like, and then he'll go on to another sentence. And it's sort of like rambling on and on and on. That's what Jeremiah is doing here. It shows that he is speaking with great emotion. These are strong exclamations that give theological perspective to this situation. It's not wrong. Nobody's saying it's wrong. I'm not saying it's wrong to do that. I'm just saying this is what we see in this passage right here. So if you'll look at the first and the last verse, verse 31 and verse 33, they both begin by negating a misconception about God. So verse 31, for the Lord will not. Verse 33, for he does not. Negating a particular misconception about God. Verse 32 doesn't do that. For if he causes grief, there's no negative there. This is observation. Just read the text and make some observation there. So the first and last verses both begin by negating a misconception about God, and you can see that because it's used in the English, it's the word not. The middle verse, verse 32, discusses the pattern of God's plan. And that is Jeremiah's anchor. That is his anchor. His stability. It comes in verse 32. And since we're in chapter 3, this reasoning is found squarely in the center of the book. 31, 32, 33. How many verses in chapter 3? 66. So verses 31, 32, and 33 are squarely in the middle of the whole book of Lamentations. And it's central to the theology of this book as well. So in the midst of suffering, there is hope because of God's person and because of God's plan. So verse 31, he says, exile is temporary. When he says, for the Lord will not reject forever. Exile is temporary. God will not reject forever. Jeremiah is saying that God is not in some way, he has not in some way rejected his people forever. Rather, he claims that such hurtful disconnection is only temporary. He will not go on rejecting his people forever, is the implication of what he's saying. The Lord will not always be rejecting Israel. Based on what? His abundant loving kindness. Jeremiah knows that the exile is provisional and not final. So he will not reject his people forever. And he's going to tell us why in verse 32. And that, remember, is his anchor. Why can I be confident of this? How is it that I can be so sure of this? Verse 32. For if he causes grief, then he will have compassion according to his abundant loving kindness. So people here should have hope and bear their shame because of their own sin, because this is not the way it will always be for Israel. So verse 32, his anchor. That verse provides further support. How does Jeremiah know that the exile is temporary and that God's anger will subside? Well, the verse is phrased in a conditional statement to show the workings of God's plan. The words that you see there, compassionate and abundant and loving kindness, they remind us of God's character as expressed in Exodus chapter 34. It's a famous verse. I think you probably have heard Exodus 34 and verses 6 through 8. Listen to this. The Lord passed by in front of him and proclaimed, the Lord God, compassionate, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness and truth, who keeps loving kindness for thousands, who forgives iniquity, transgression, and sin. You hear that description of God? Well, Jeremiah knows this aspect of God's character. And so in verse 32, how do we know that the Lord will not reject forever? For if he causes grief, then he will have compassion according to his abundant loving kindness. He knows the character of God. And the character of God is what keeps Jeremiah from going over the edge, so to speak. Keeps Jeremiah from checking it in. Keeps Jeremiah from doing harm to himself. From despairing ultimately. Those words there. Look in Lamentations chapter 3, look up at verse 22. The Lord's loving kindness indeed never cease, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Jeremiah knows this. He sees this. There's a passage in Deuteronomy chapter 30 and verses 1 through 11. That Deuteronomy text provides the basis for the new covenant that's mentioned in Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 31, there's what we know as the new covenant. God will restore his people. He will restore his nation. So this verse 32, draws on the theology that stems from all the way back to the earlier chapters in the Bible, the Pentateuch, and it runs all the way through Jeremiah. God has a covenant plan to both punish his people when they disobey, put them in exile, and to show abundant mercy on them through the new covenant when one day he will bring all his people back to Israel. He will give them a heart to believe, and they will see the Lord Jesus Christ. Zechariah tells us they will weep as though, when they see him, they will weep as though a mother weeps who has lost her son. And they will realize it was them who murdered their Messiah. All of this is wrapped up in this. You see in verse 32, if he causes grief, the if statement there is a conditional sentence. And it would be understood by these people that are listening to this as since God has grieved, not if he has grieved. If God has grieved, and he has, then he will have compassion according. So if this is the case, that he has caused grief, and it is clearly so, then the other part of God's plan must also be true. Namely, he will show compassion according to his loving kindness. He will one day restore his deep love to his people, a love that is like a mother's to her child. And such care will facilitate the fulfillment of his promises to them. The notion of mercy becomes a core part of the future hope of Israel. And the point in all of this is that just as the exile is real, so is the conclusion of exile. It will be equally real with all of its future transformation, glory, and fulfillment. God's compassion based on his extravagant commitment to his covenant will accomplish this. His loving kindness, in other words, will accomplish this. There's a tremendous amount of theology in all of this to bring bring all of the Old Testament into this. And finally, in verse 33, there is God's character. For God does not afflict willingly. There's that negation. People negating something. Well, God's going to do this. It's just like God. He won't do this. He will afflict willingly. He will cause us grief. He's a God who doesn't like us. And the negative there states the opposite. God does not afflict willingly or grieve the sons of men. His character is what he's talking about here. Now, do you see in verse 33? Yes, verse 33. For he does not afflict willingly. Is that what you have in your text? Okay. You know what that willingly is? Literally. Lave. L-B-B. And that word in Hebrew is heart. He does not afflict from the heart. Does it have that in your margins? From your heart? He does not afflict from his heart is literally what that word says, what that word is. And that's the key term here. So Jeremiah has this confidence in God's plan, and it rules out false conception, this false conception that many people have, namely that God has afflicted them maliciously. And Jeremiah is saying God does not do this. That key term there, from translated willingly, is from his heart. And the idea indicates God's first instinct or what he deliberately desires to do. When it's from the heart, it's from his very core of who he is. Indicates God's first instinct or what he deliberately desires to do. He does not derive pleasure from afflicting his people. That's what he is saying. That's what Jeremiah is saying. He does not derive pleasure from afflicting his people. Put it in a more positive way, God desires to bless and to dwell with his people, is what he's saying. So verse 31 and verse 33 provide two complementary reasons for why exile must end. It must. Verse 31 states that based upon God's plan, the exile must be temporary. God's loving kindness will ultimately win out. He cannot reject Israel forever. He's already made promises to them. Hence, the negative effects of the exile will be done away with. They cannot persist. Verse 33, in light of the context there of verse 32, verse 33 testifies that the exile must not only fade, but give way to a time of future hope and restoration. God's heart, God's intention is not wrath, but blessing. Exile must press on to hope. Exile is temporary, whether one examines it from the vantage point of God's disposition within the exile or God's intention for the exile. God's character determines that there is a sure hope. From whatever angle you look at the situation, there is hope. This is not permanent. God has already promised them he will restore them. That's what Jeremiah is reflecting upon. Now, this is a fascinating piece of Scripture, verses 31 through 39. It's the core of this whole book. Jeremiah is coming to grips with what God is doing, and it is a huge, huge lesson for us. You translate these truths into our life today. We are the object of God's special, unique covenant. He has made a promise to us that he will not leave us. We have been promised, we have been given all the spiritual blessing in the heavenlies, and we've been promised of all the blessings in the future that he has for his children will be ours. That nothing can separate us, that this process that has begun in us will be completed. So regardless of the things that take place in this world, that will never be moved. That will never be removed. That is our anchor. Just as God's promise to Israel is Jeremiah's anchor. It's another argument for for the distinction between Israel and the church. It's another argument for the millennial kingdom, 1,000-year millennial kingdom. He made these promises to a nation, the nation Israel. Deuteronomy 7, this nation, among all the nations of the world, I have chosen you to be my nation, my special group of people on this earth. And those promises are still valid. We are not Israel. We are not spiritual Israel. We have not taken Israel's place. Every time Israel and the church are used in the New Testament, they're always different. They're never synonymous. So this is a huge blessing that God gave to Jeremiah, and it's a huge blessing for us. The same God who made these promises to Israel will fulfill them. The same God who made promises to us will fulfill them. If he dropped the ball with Israel, he may very well drop the ball in your life, which we know is not the case. Any questions? A lot of information. Good stuff. Be encouraged. Beloved, you are in the hands of Almighty God, and nothing can touch you. Nothing can take you out of his hands.